young women are being instrumentalized by a very well-organized Islamist movement that aspires to the destruction of Western civilization.
Progressive radicalism, Islamic radicalism, and then the far right. Which one keeps you up at night more?
And this is really an unexpected twist, that the radical cultural left joins forces with the Islamists, first on campuses and then elsewhere. The one key issue that binds them together is the really interesting thing that I think I underestimated while it was happening was,
I'm often struck by, when I see these protesters, I feel that they're not really shouting about the real place of Israel and Gaza or the real people.
It is part of fashion, and at some point there will be Gaza fatigue.
Now, the final thing I wanted to discuss with you is faith.
There is a kind of logic in saying we belong together. This is not, I think, easily reconciled with a large Muslim population because Islam makes much more radical claims than Christianity or Judaism, because Islam is both political and spiritual doctrine.
Hello and welcome to The Brink. I'm Andrew Fox.
And I'm Jake Wallace-Simons, and today we are joined by the eminent historian Sir Niall Ferguson for a chat which was another of the interviews which I used in writing my book, Never Again, How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself.
If you're listening, please do give us 5 stars. And if you're looking online, don't forget to like, subscribe, give us a follow and a comment if you've got something to say. We love to hear from you.
And of course, stick around right until the end, because Andrew will be back to discuss Sir Niall's interview with me in retrospect and see what we both made of it. So stick around until the end, but until then, I present Niall Ferguson on The Brink. Welcome to The Brink. I'm Jake Wallace-Simons, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Niall Ferguson, the eminent historian, broadcaster and writer. So Niall, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Jake.
So we were just discussing the throes of writing that we're both almost submerged by at the moment. And in my case, I'm working on my new book, and the title will give you a good sense of what it's about. It's called Never Again, How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself. And I just want to take an idea which I'm working on in the book and lay it in front of you and have you explore it and think about it and respond. And it's the idea of centrist fundamentalism. And what that means really is that in the smoking wreckage of the Second World War in Europe, the Western elites embarked on a project of ensuring that Nazism could never happen again. And they seemed to trace the characteristics of Hitler's regime to what were formerly natural human instincts and virtues. So, for example, they looked at Hitler's jingoism and traced it to natural patriotism, and took Hitler's xenophobia and traced it to a belief in borders and the idea of distinguishing between the outside and the inside of your country, of your group, and Hitler's nationalist chauvinism and traced it to a respect for one's own traditions and culture. And so they imposed this new dogma or orthodoxy that was pro-open borders, pro-cultural relativism. Every culture is as good as every other, and you mustn't denigrate any other culture apart from maybe your own. A sort of suicidal inclusivity, globalism, mass immigration, and you know the rest. And the reason why I think it's fundamentalist is that it policed itself by mocking, deriding, and making taboo any challenges or anybody who upheld those older values of patriotism and so forth. So people who voted for Brexit or Trump were racist. I mean, there's a debate to be had there, but the debate wasn't had. It was just that those views were now taboo and couldn't be articulated. And anybody who wanted to talk about mainly people of Pakistani origin running sex rings in northern England were immediately condemned as being Islamophobic. And I think this vacated the centre ground for the rise of radical ideas, such as radical progressivism, radical Islam, and radical right-wing national chauvinism. So that's the concept. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to think about this as an historian, and it might be the first part of what you said that I'd take issue with. In the wake of World War II, the elites of Europe had quite a wide variety of different theories for what had caused Hitler and the Holocaust. And I think it's a mistake to say there was a consensus. There was a project to create a European Union, though nobody called it that at first. That had been tried before. There was a pan-European movement in the 1920s and 30s, but it had failed. In its second iteration, the idea of European integration was supposed to be economic, and it had its origins in the coal and steel community. Christian Democrats and Social Democrats disagreed about many things, but one thing they quickly agreed on: communism was bad. And I think one has to recognize that by the late 1940s, right the way through until the 1980s, the key lesson of history was not, we've got to do everything to stop Hitler or the Holocaust happening again. It was actually, we've got to stop communism from taking over any more of the world than it already controlled by the end of the 1940s. And so I think those were the key ideas of the Cold War era. And it only began to fracture when interventions in Vietnam, for example, elicited a great backlash against American imperialism, quote unquote, amongst a younger generation on both sides of the Atlantic. The things that you're talking about, the things that have given rise to what you call centrist fundamentalism, seem to me of much more recent provenance, and to have come out of the post-Cold War vacuum that was created when communism collapsed, or seemed to collapse, everywhere in Eastern Europe. And in that period in the 1990s, when the Cold War had been won, and all the arguments seemed to be over, when Francis Fukuyama said that history had ended, that was when projects that produced globalization suddenly were let loose. And those projects were quite radical in terms of trade, capital flows, and flows of migrants. So I think the great global moment, which people today associate with the World Economic Forum at Davos or Aspen Ideas, that's really the 1990s and 2000s. And then just to add one last point of refinement, there's this curious metamorphosis on the left, which I think came about because they'd so totally lost the economic arguments. And that is a metamorphosis that produces a new kind of Marxism in which class is replaced by identity concepts, whether racial or gender-based, sexual. That's the new politics of the left. And at first, it's completely marginal and only really exists in wacky university departments. The really interesting thing that I think I underestimated while it was happening was that in the curious circumstances after 9/11, when American power with substantial European support was directed against the perpetrators of 9/11, the radical left was able to gain ground using the old anti-war tactics that the Vietnam generation had pioneered. So you get these anti-war protests, you get attacks on the Bush administration. And in that period, which is really the kind of period of the late George W. Bush presidency, you then get the financial crisis on top of that. And that creates even more opportunity for the radical left to gain adherents. And the last thing that happens, and this is really an unexpected twist, is that the radical cultural left joins forces with the Islamists, first on campuses and then elsewhere. And the issue that they find, the one key issue that binds them together, is anti-Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Judaism. It takes many different forms, but that's the process that I see. And I think that final phase was only crystallized as recently as October 7th, 2023. But it was in the making for roughly 10 years before then. That's a refinement of your narrative, but it seems to me a more accurate description of the intellectual ebbs and flows that got us to where we are today.
You're right, and certainly the common denominator of anti-Semitism and Israelophobia that's emerged in the past, certainly since October the 7th, but before was bubbling under before then, is really the lens through which my book is looking at the subject of the West in its decline. I think that we're probably more in agreement than it would seem about the origins of it. I wasn't seeking to suggest that it was a monolithic idea from the beginning, but more that it had its roots in Karl Popper's or Open Society and its enemies, those sorts of ideas that then came to dominate over time in the West. But I do think that, as you've pointed out, that it's that sort of centrist fundamentalism which opened the playing field for the insurgency of radicalisms. And you've mentioned progressive radicalism and Islamic radicalism, which amazingly enough, have become conjoined via the rise, perhaps, of identity politics and decolonization theory. If we can just spend a bit of time talking about that, the roots of that, the roots of whatever we call it, people call it woke identity politics. I call it progressive radicalism. It seems to come from a number of sources. There's the influence of the Soviet Union and the propaganda efforts they exerted upon the American Academy and elsewhere, left-wing propaganda sheets and so forth in the West. There's also the rise of critical race theory and race politics and other things. Do you want to just explore which influences do you think were the driving forces behind this new trend that's come to dominate our societies?
You know, I don't think ideas are kind of living things that move through society in the way that viruses do.
The Dawkins would say.
I mean, I think that the only way to understand the things that we're discussing is to see that the ideas are kind of there on library shelves or on the internet, but it's people who decide whether they gain currency and become the basis for action. And I think one has to recognize that the universities were places where people were paid to propose and teach, communicate radical ideas. Nobody else really wanted them. They weren't popular. Books about gender rights and critical race theory are unreadable, and they only became bestsellers when they were shoved down people's throats in the strange moral panic of 2020. Prior to that, these kinds of thing, these books and the articles that academics wrote weren't widely read. They existed in universities, in humanities departments, in departments of African American studies, in departments of gender studies. Many of these departments had come into existence after the 1968 student wave of protest, but it was really only gradually that they became significant parts of the academic establishment. But they grew. I could see this in my own discipline, history, where the geographical focus of what was being taught at American universities didn't change. There was still way more US historians than was really justifiable. But what the US historians did changed from studying the history of the American polity or the Constitution to studying social and cultural issues of identity politics, usually having to do with the experience of African American communities and the experience of women, and then the experience of gays and lesbians. All of that happened within the academy. There was a constituency for it. These subjects were notoriously easier than, say, astrophysics or advanced mathematics. So there was a constituency for these subjects, and they were notoriously not very toughly graded. So you've got this population of students who see opportunity, and academics who see opportunity, and then academic administrators and university leaders who say, we've got to show our bona fides and signal that we are not only liberal but progressive. So we'll expand these departments, and when historians are hiring new historians, we'll encourage them not to hire old white guys who work on war and peace, but to hire women or quote unquote people of color who work on social and cultural issues. So this all goes on more or less unnoticed by anybody else inside all the major universities over a period of maybe 20 years. And the backdrop, the sort of context within which this is happening, is a series of big outside shocks like 9/11 and the financial crisis and then COVID. And these are the shocks that young people experience that create economic uncertainty or create other anxieties. And then they get 4 years of exposure to these ideas. And these ideas are offering a series of profound critiques of the status quo. Critique number one: the United States is a terrible place based on white supremacy, slavery, and it hasn't really improved despite emancipation. In truth, it's still a racist society. Idea one. Idea two: it's a patriarchy in which the feminists have achieved almost nothing because there are glass ceilings everywhere and women don't get paid as much as men. And that's also very bad. And, it's capitalist. I forgot. It's a highly unequal society in which wicked corporations pursue profit. And not only do they do that, but they also destroy the environment because they don't care about climate change, whereas young people do. And so these ideas are kind of added onto one another, and they become a comprehensive explanation of the wickedness of the world, and particularly the United States. But there's a missing ingredient, and the missing ingredient is supplied by Israel, because there's something a little unsatisfying about Americans hating America. There's a sense in which that'll always be a bit hard to sell to, you guessed it, other Americans. So what you need to do is find some additional level villain, and the additional level villain is Israel. And so you have to recast the history of Israel. It stops being the project to create a homeland for Jews that has an added urgency after the Holocaust, and you turn it into the extreme version of settler colonialism, which is the thing that you hate the British for and you hate all the Europeans for. And you say, actually, Israel is an extreme case of settler colonialism, because actually the Palestinians were these lovable indigenous people, and along came wicked settler colonial Jews and created this dreadful state. And then you add on a few other things like apartheid, and then you say it commits genocide, and you think of all the bad things that have ever happened in history and you attribute them to Israel, and that creates a perfect enemy. And of course it also creates a basis on which you can unite all kinds of progressivist movements, radical progressive movements, as you call them, with the Islamist movement that meanwhile has been busy building itself a constituency and a funding operation and a whole bunch of institutions inside the academy. That's, I think, how it played out. It's a gradual process, mostly imperceptible. Most people who graduated from elite universities in the 1980s and 1990s have no idea about any of this. They're quite oblivious to it. They write big checks to the universities if they've made a lot of money on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley, and they think everything is good. You know, I've done well. I did well partly because I got a degree from Harvard. I give some money back to Harvard. I get my name on a building. The world is good. Oh, and my son and my daughter also get to go to Harvard because of all that. October 7th is the moment of revelation, and everybody's shocked to discover that there are these profoundly anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic elements inside the universities, and they're completely mystified to find that they're not just being proposed and disseminated by Islamist groups. They're being proposed and disseminated by all kinds of radical leftist groups. And everybody's just baffled by this. They can't understand it. And so they blame the university presidents. And they say, well, it's all the fault of Claudine Gay or the other presidents of the other universities, not recognizing that that doesn't really satisfactorily explain what had happened. You can't really put it on a bunch of university presidents because it's something much more profound than that.
Yeah, I mean, the position of Israel in all of this is fundamental, I think, or it's been made to be fundamental. And since October the 7th, as you've said, we've seen that very powerfully. There's been this idea of intersectionality around for a while in critical race theory, which has come to mean a kind of all for one for all approach towards this suite of causes embraced by the radical progressive. So if you are a race campaigner, then when a transgender campaigner has their cause, you have to support that. You know, if you're a climate campaigner, then when the others raise their banners for their causes, you have to support that because they've got the lived experience that you can't question. Therefore, you've just got to show them ultimate solidarity, unquestioning solidarity. And since October the 7th, the main banner that was raised above all of these armies, if you like, was the Palestinian one. It became the principal rallying cry for this whole movement to take to the streets and to assert itself. And one thing I wanted to discuss with you was our ability to stand in the way of this, because it's not a great number of people who are true believers of this ideology, whatever its manifestation. They've successfully managed to impose it upon society in such a way that articulating alternative points of view are widely seen as taboo, even though people don't think they should be taboo. People often say, I mean, one of the things you often hear is, I'm not allowed to say that. People have internalized the idea of what they can and cannot say because of the radicalism that's been allowed to set the climate. I feel that it's to do with the collapse of our ability to articulate our own values because of the repression of centrist fundamentalism, that it's become taboo to be able to say, look, I think people should be equal and there shouldn't be a divisive racism coming from the other side of the argument that's driving a wedge through our societies. I think that welcoming many people who have views inimical to this country and who harbour jihadism among them into this country in huge numbers is wrong, because I value our way of life and I want people who are going to assimilate into it in reasonable numbers. And we haven't been allowed to stand up for ourselves because that's been rendered taboo, and therefore the intersectionality component has allowed the radicals to unite behind the Palestinian flag and dominate the debate in a way that most people feel a little bit resentful of.
I think there is a social life of the protesting crowd. People, particularly as they grow older, forget the fun of being in the crowd. And therefore they underestimate the banality of the motives of most people who participate in demonstrations. As has become clear from the studies that have been done of the protests that followed October 7th, the bizarre protests against Israel, when one might have expected protests in support of Israel after those atrocities, we can see a number of interesting features. Many people who took part in the campus protests turned out not to have the remotest understanding of the issues that they were protesting about. They didn't know which river, they didn't know which sea, and they were chanting from the river to the sea. Secondly, the encampments that occurred where people pitched tents and sought to visibly disrupt campus life disproportionately happened at the elite institutions that charge the highest tuition and are most prestigious. And thirdly, again, somewhat counterintuitively, the protests were disproportionately female. Many, many more women than men participated in the protests in 2023-24.
That's something I haven't heard before or seen. Yeah, interesting.
So, and you can see this actually if you look at recent events in Colombia and at Barnard. So, what's going on here? People who don't seem to have a very good grasp of the issue. The people who are clearly part of the social elite, or at least are being assimilated into it at the Ivy League, and they are disproportionately women. I think it's the social life of the crowd that you need to understand here. Intersectionality is a silly idea. It's a silly word. It's essentially an attempt to elevate complex hierarchies of identity according to the level of historical victimhood that they've experienced. And it's very arbitrary. I don't know who gets to decide this. I don't know who decides that the Jews are not at the top of the victimhood league table.
They're the oppressor.
You'd have thought that they'd at least be a top 3 contender, given all the persecution they've suffered throughout history, and given the fact that the Holocaust is the supreme and unique example of a systematic industrialized genocide. But no, arbitrarily, they are classified as up there with the dead white males as the oppressors. So this is a completely silly and ridiculous ideology that only people who are intellectually quite impaired can take seriously. And it's not really the ideology that's at work here. It's the social life that's at work. And you put your finger on it when you said that you're not allowed to say things. It's a package. The different ideas that we've been talking about are part of a package that is really designed to make thought unnecessary.
Yeah.
You don't need to really read and engage in debate, because you have supplied to you the straightforward components of a Manichaean worldview in which you know what's good and bad, and you know that white men bad, women of color good. You know Palestinians good, Jews bad. You know all of these things, and you don't really need to think. You just need to affirm your allegiance to the tribe of woke students. And in order to have something to organize around, you need something that everybody can uncritically get behind. They've tried various things. I mean, the climate change movement had a shot at this. Greta Thunberg tried to mobilize young people on the Save the Planet, Extinction is Coming platform. It actually wasn't that successful. Wasn't really that good. Just a bunch of people throwing super paintings doesn't get you there. So what do? You try a whole bunch of different things. And it turns out the one that works is pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. And I think part of the reason that it works is that the resources are there. The resources are there because the Muslim Brotherhood has been carefully preparing the way for organized anti-Israel protests, and it has established the points of contact with the woke left. And so the mobilization takes place with amazing speed. I think the most remarkable thing about what happened after October 7, 2023 was how fast these demonstrations took place, how quickly they were organized. And that, I think, speaks to the role that the Muslim Brotherhood and its various affiliates have played. But if you're one of the young women who, dons the Palestinian scarf and participates in these protests, often disrupting university life, heckling speakers, you're in this is your social life. This is your social life. Doesn't have profound. It's not based on a profound understanding of the Middle East, because most of those people have never been there. They've never been to Israel, and they'd struggle to name the river and the sea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm often struck by when I see these protesters, I feel that they're not really shouting about the real place of Israel and Gaza or the real people. I mean, the fact that they're wearing a keffiyeh and a crop top alone shows a total disjunction between the world they're inhabiting and the reality.
What they're really shouting. It's a fashion statement. It's nothing other than a fashion statement. It's devoid of deep understanding, and it could easily be replaced by something else. I mean, we did go with amazing speed from Black Lives Matter to Ukraine Matters between 2020 and 2022. And I remember Mark Andreessen joking that Ukraine was the current thing and there would be a new current thing in due course. And indeed there was, because a year and a half later, the current thing was the Palestinians and Gaza. So it is part of fashion. And at some point, there will be Gaza fatigue, especially if Hamas is completely destroyed. It'll be hard to keep that going. And they'll have to find another current thing. But I think that's roughly what we're seeing. And one doesn't know whether to laugh or cry about it, because at some level it's ridiculous and risible. But then you realize that these young people, these young women, are being instrumentalized by a very well organized Islamist movement that aspires to the destruction of Western civilization as well as the state of Israel. So that's the sort of cry part.
That's right. And I mean, on the one hand, there's this the frothiness of the student protesters. You said it was fashion, and it is fashion, but it's a kind of self-fashioning. It's displaying your own politics. It's not about the real place and the real people. It's not about concern for Muslims being killed. It's about showing yourself to the world. It's very self-regarding. And that's all frothy and risible and ridiculous. But it's being instrumentalized, as you've said, by some very serious people. Who have a very serious agenda, and it's a political agenda, and the end goal that it has is the dismantlement and destruction of the world's only Jewish state. And those people are not only in the Middle East, they are also in the Western democracies, and they are working to that end in various means. And of course, the destruction of Israel is only the precursor to the dominance of the West and so forth. It feels like I keep coming back to this idea of how are we going to turn the tide on this developing threat that seems to have such deep roots in our democratic system, in our legal system, such deep influences over our elements of our pockets of our politics and pockets of our culture. How can we begin to stand up against that if we don't find a way to shamelessly articulate reasonable values of patriotism and liberalism and so on, which shouldn't be controversial to articulate?
And I think the challenge in the 2020s is that politics is increasingly a pastime that people engage in as much on social media as on the street. And that the social media algorithms incentivize the taking of extreme positions so that the center ground ends up being largely vacated. Because if you are a young person and you dislike all of this and have no desire to participate in these protests, you don't default to the things that you just referred to, a sane liberalism and a moderate patriotism, but rather you embrace the MAGA alternative. Yeah. That is to say, you embrace a right-wing, overtly nationalistic, perhaps overtly male chauvinistic ideology, and that's available. It's available in podcast form. It's available in Twitter form. It's it's a readily available alternative set of positions. And there's a great many young men on both sides of the Atlantic who are so disgusted with the woke antics they encounter in education that they say, well, we'll take that because it's quite satisfying to adopt those positions, not least because they utterly enrage the people you dislike. So what I'm witnessing is a quite remarkable polarization that is not so much between the generations, though to some extent it is, but it's increasingly between the sexes amongst the younger generation. And it doesn't leave a whole lot of people in the middle espousing classical liberal values, because those don't get much traction on social media. So I think we have to recognize that it's very difficult to counter the radical left's alliance with Islamism, because you quickly find yourself with some rather unsavory company.
Yes.
And that has been a recurrent problem for more than a decade in European and in British politics too. You can't feel entirely comfortable with elements of the populist right, because on close inspection they may include people on the far right who are anti-Semitic too. Or you may find yourself uncomfortably close to people who seem rather keen on President Putin as a leader. So it's a very, very hazardous landscape that we now inhabit. And those of us who have a certain idea of Britain, a certain idea of Britain as a tolerant place, but a place that nevertheless has a set of values that include Christianity and Judaism, but also include a respect for tradition, for the monarchy, a respect for the landscape. That certain idea of Britain, or of England if you prefer, has a diminishing appeal. And it's a diminishing appeal that you can see if you go to church, because the churches are largely empty. It has a diminishing appeal because you realize that for a very large proportion of the population that was born outside the UK, and we're talking about close to a fifth of the population now, these things don't have any resonance. They don't have any cultural affinity with that idea of England. So it's a difficult thing to make the arguments that I think you want to make, because the constituency for those arguments is quite small, and you'll find that there are people who agree with some of what you say who at the same time believe things that you don't believe and don't want to be associated with. I don't have a quick solution to this. I don't have an answer. I'm just acutely aware that there's this song I keep thinking of from the 70s by a Scottish band called Steelers Wheel. And the song was Stuck in the Middle with You.
Yes.
And it's got the great line, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. And that's increasingly my sense of where I am. I'm stuck in the middle with you, Jake.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Neil. That's going to be going around in my head for the rest of the day. But it's funny. I mean, you've taken me on to the final two topics I wanted to cover, which was the far right and faith. So if you can just explore the far right a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so in my book, I'm talking about the new radicalism, which I give three elements to, like a triangle. There's progressive radicalism, Islamic radicalism, and then the far right, or nationalist chauvinism, whatever you want to call it. And that's something which isn't really much of a tradition in Britain. We haven't really ever had much of a taste for fascism on these islands. I mean, if you look at the far right, you get what, Nigel Farage. I mean, by comparison to the far right parties in Europe and far right actors in America, he's a liberal. And then you get to Tommy Robinson, and then in America you have actual Nazis, people with swastika tattoos who have guns and who have websites called the Daily Stormer or whatever it's called. I mean, how much of a threat do you feel that the far right? I mean, can we still talk about the West? I don't know if we can talk about the West as a single entity anymore because of the increasing divergence between the various poles of it. But if you're able to weigh up the far right against the far left radicals, which one keeps you up at night more?
It's a very difficult question to answer because we're talking about a really complex and heterogeneous group of parties and organizations. And even within the United States, the term far right covers a multitude of different movements or ideas. In Europe, as might be expected, of nationalist movements, there are dozens. Each nation state has its own far right, and the Dutch far right, and the German far right, and the Italian far right, they don't have much in common, really. The AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, is a case I know well. It's polling very strongly in Germany. It has found itself endorsed unexpectedly by Elon Musk and Vice President J.D. Vance. But if one looks closely at the AfD, it's a strange coalition between some economic radical libertarians and some outright National Socialists, including anti-Semites. Not the kind of people you'd particularly want to go down to a beer cellar with.
Yeah.
And I'm struck as I survey the landscape of these different movements, how little they have in common, and how awkward it would be if you assemble them all into one place, and how awkward it would be for Nigel Farage, who's not a fascist. I mean, Nigel's a populist conservative who, if he'd been born 20 years earlier, would probably have been an enthusiastic supporter of Enoch Powell, but an appalled opponent of skinheads. And that's the kind of English predicament, and it has been throughout our lives and throughout our parents' lives. The far right can occasionally mobilize disillusioned conservatives who've fallen out with the Conservative Party for one reason or another. And whether it's on immigration or on the economy or for whatever reason, these people break away from the Tory party and look for a new home to the right. And they start work and they create a new party. And then inexorably and inevitably, it turns out to attract the kind of people that they're deeply embarrassed by, who, whether they're skinheads, neo-Nazis, or just crooks and thugs, you just can't avoid having in a far-right party. A far-right party without crooks and thugs just isn't going to get to critical mass. So that's what I see. And I think it's a recurrent feature of British history. New parties come along, they get some energy out of disillusionment with the Conservatives, and then after a certain relatively short space of time, there are too many crooks and thugs for them to be viable. It happened to Oswald Mosley. The other thing that's important here, Jake, is that the geopolitical landscape can suddenly turn against you. You're far-right politician arguing that Britain is corrupt and the Jews are too powerful, and you're doing quite well until World War II. And then you're likely a traitor. And I think if I'm looking at the situation of everybody from Reform right across to the AfD, the problem with the current moment is that if the net effect of the Trump administration is to condemn Ukraine to partition, Russia to victory, and Europe to chronic insecurity in the wake of that, I don't think that's going to make the people very popular who were endorsed by the Trump administration. So my general advice to people on the far right is,
if you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk. And don't forget to grab a copy of my brand new book, Never Again: How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself, in all good bookshops now.